This is the story of one of the darkest chapters in criminal history in rural North Carolina, where faith, madness, and unspeakable horror converged beneath the frozen earth of December 1941. What transpired in the candlelit depths of St. Bartholomew's abandoned crypt would challenge everything we understand about human nature and divine intervention. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a like, as this investigation into one of America's most disturbing religious mysteries demands our careful attention to details that authorities have spent 8 decades attempting to suppress. The winter of 1941 arrived early in Caldwell County, North Carolina, bringing with it a bitter cold that seemed to seep into the very bones of the mountain communities scattered throughout the Appalachian foothills. St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church had stood abandoned for nearly 15 years, its Gothic revival spire casting long shadows across the overgrown cemetery, where weathered headstones marked the final resting places of the region's earliest settlers. The church itself, constructed in 1847 from local granite, possessed architectural features uncommon for rural North Carolina, including an elaborate underground crypt system that extended far deeper into the hillside than any normal burial vault should require. Father Bernard Matthias Kellerman, age 57, had arrived in Caldwell County that autumn with impeccable credentials from the Episcopal Diocese of Maryland. According to personnel records preserved in the Baltimore Diocesan Archives, Father Kellerman had served with distinction in 3 parishes over a 23-year career, earning particular recognition for his work with displaced families during the Great Depression. However, documents discovered by researcher Dr. Margaret Whitfield in 1967 revealed troubling gaps in Kellerman's service record, including an unexplained 18-month absence from active ministry between 1938 and 1940. Local newspaper accounts from the Caldwell County Herald describe Kellerman as a tall, gaunt figure with piercing gray eyes and an unsettling habit of conducting private prayers in abandoned sacred spaces throughout the region. The congregation that gathered around Father Kellerman during those final months of 1941 consisted primarily of families who had drifted away from established churches due to theological disputes or personal crises of faith. Among them were the Morrison family, led by patriarch Samuel Morrison, a widowed tobacco farmer struggling to maintain his land. The 3 Hensley sisters, spinsters ranging in age from 42 to 58, who had cared for their invalid mother until her death the previous spring, and young couples like Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood, newlyweds whose first child had been stillborn just weeks before they encountered Kellerman's unorthodox ministry. According to surviving correspondence found in the estate of deceased parishioner Ruth Hensley, Father Kellerman possessed an extraordinary ability to identify and exploit the deepest spiritual wounds of his followers. His sermons, delivered in private homes and remote clearings, focused obsessively on themes of divine abandonment, celestial indifference, and the necessity of extreme sacrifice to capture God's attention in a world consumed by global warfare. Margaret Hensley's diary, discovered during renovations of the family homestead in 1963, contains disturbing entries describing Kellerman's growing influence over the small congregation and his increasingly bizarre interpretations of biblical scripture. The tragedy that would forever mark this remote corner of North Carolina began with Kellerman's announcement during the second week of December 1941 that their Christmas Eve service would be held in the crypt beneath St. Bartholomew's abandoned church. According to witness statements given to Sheriff William Barclay Henderson immediately following the incident, Kellerman claimed to have received a divine vision instructing him to conduct this special service in the underground chambers, where, he insisted, the spiritual barriers between earth and heaven were thinnest. 43 members of Kellerman's congregation gathered at the desolate church grounds as snow began falling on the evening of December 24th. Among them were entire families, including the Morrisons, the Hensley sisters, the Blackwoods, and at least 6 children ranging in age from 4 to 16 years old. Contemporary weather records from the National Weather Service indicate that temperatures had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit by sunset, with wind gusts reaching 35 miles per hour across the exposed hillside, where the abandoned church stood silhouetted against the winter sky. The entrance to St. Bartholomew's crypt required participants to descend a narrow stone staircase that curved sharply to the left after the first dozen steps, disappearing into complete darkness beneath the church's foundation. Archaeological surveys conducted by the University of North Carolina in 1969 revealed that these underground chambers extended approximately 47 feet into the hillside, terminating in a circular room roughly 18 feet in diameter, with ceiling height reaching 12 feet at its apex. The walls, constructed from the same granite as the church above, bore carved symbols that Dr. James Whitmore of Duke University's Religious Studies Department described in his 1971 paper as bearing remarkable similarities to pre-Christian Celtic religious iconography found in remote regions of Ireland and Scotland. The service itself began at approximately 9:15 on Christmas Eve, according to the testimony of surviving witness Patricia Morrison, Samuel Morrison's 19-year-old daughter, who managed to escape the crypt during the early stages of what she described as Father Kellerman's descent into apparent madness. Patricia's statement to Sheriff Henderson, preserved in the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department archives, describes the underground chamber illuminated by dozens of white candles arranged in precise geometric patterns across the stone floor. The congregation sat in concentric circles around a makeshift altar constructed from stacked stones and draped with white linen that Patricia noted with disturbing clarity appeared stained with dark brown spots that resembled dried blood. Father Kellerman began the service with traditional Christmas hymns and familiar biblical readings, but Patricia Morrison's testimony indicates that the atmosphere in the crypt became increasingly oppressive as the ceremony progressed. The air grew thick and difficult to breathe, despite the chamber's apparent ventilation through several narrow shafts that extended upward toward the church foundation. More disturbing still were the sounds that began emanating from deeper within the crypt system, beyond the main chamber where the congregation had gathered. Patricia described these noises as resembling human voices engaged in conversation, though she could not distinguish individual words or determine how many people might be speaking. By 10:30, according to Patricia's account, Father Kellerman had begun deviating significantly from any recognizable Christian liturgy. His sermon, which she remembered with remarkable precision despite the traumatic circumstances, focused on the necessity of blood sacrifice to awaken a God who had grown deaf to human suffering. Kellerman spoke of ancient covenants that predated Christ's teachings, of spiritual truths hidden within the deepest foundations of Christian doctrine, and of the special role that isolated communities like theirs must play in humanity's ongoing struggle for divine attention. The congregation's response to these increasingly disturbing theological pronouncements varied considerably, according to Patricia Morrison's eyewitness account. Some members, particularly the older adults who had followed Kellerman longest, appeared to accept his words with growing enthusiasm, swaying rhythmically and occasionally calling out phrases in what sounded like Latin or possibly another ancient language entirely. Others, including several parents with young children, began showing signs of distress and confusion as Kellerman's sermon continued. The critical turning point came shortly before 11 o'clock, when Father Kellerman announced that their Christmas celebration would require a special demonstration of faith that would prove their worthiness for God's renewed attention. From beneath his ceremonial robes, he produced an ornate silver knife with a curved blade approximately 8 inches in length. Later investigation by State Police Detective Raymond Walsh revealed that this weapon matched the description of a ritual athame reported stolen from a private collection of medieval religious artifacts in Baltimore during the summer of 1940, precisely during the period when Kellerman's whereabouts remained unaccounted for in official diocesan records. Patricia Morrison's escape from the crypt occurred during the confusion that followed Kellerman's production of the ceremonial knife. As several congregation members began moving toward the chamber's stone walls in apparent preparation for some type of ritual activity, Patricia managed to reach the narrow staircase, leading back to the church's main level. Her last clear memory of the underground chamber involved seeing Father Kellerman approaching her younger brother Timothy, age 12, while speaking in the strange ancient language that several congregation members had begun repeating in unison. The climb from the crypt to ground level took Patricia several minutes due to the steep angle of the stone staircase and her state of panic. Once outside, she discovered that the snowfall had intensified considerably, with accumulations already reaching 4 inches and wind conditions making travel extremely hazardous. Despite these obstacles, Patricia began the 3-mile journey to the nearest neighbor's farm. Arriving at the Henderson property at approximately 11:45, with severe frostbite on her hands and feet, but alive and coherent enough to alert authorities to the situation developing beneath St. Bartholomew's abandoned church. Sheriff William Henderson, a 23-year veteran of law enforcement in Caldwell County, received Patricia Morrison's report with initial skepticism that quickly transformed into serious concern as she provided increasingly specific details about the evening's events. Henderson's official incident report, filed on December 25th and preserved in county archives, indicates that he immediately contacted State Police headquarters in Raleigh to request emergency assistance, citing the remote location, severe weather conditions, and potential for multiple casualties at the abandoned church site. The rescue expedition that departed for St. Bartholomew's Church at 12:30 on Christmas morning included Sheriff Henderson, Deputy Marcus Webb, State Police Detective Raymond Walsh, Dr. Franklin Pierce from Caldwell County Hospital, and volunteer firefighters Samuel Crawford and Robert Hayes. Weather conditions continued deteriorating throughout their journey, with snow accumulations reaching 8 inches and temperatures dropping to 9 degrees Fahrenheit. The men required nearly 2 hours to cover the difficult terrain leading to the abandoned church, arriving at the site around 2:15 in the morning. Their initial survey of the church grounds revealed no signs of the 42 vehicles that should have been present if Patricia Morrison's account was accurate. The snow surrounding the building appeared undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading away from the church toward the direction Patricia had taken during her escape. However, the main entrance to the church building stood open, and the rescue team could detect the faint odor of extinguished candles drifting upward from the crypt entrance. Sheriff Henderson's descent into the underground chamber, accompanied by Detective Walsh and Dr. Pierce, revealed a scene that would haunt all 3 men for the remainder of their lives. The crypt's main room appeared exactly as Patricia Morrison had described, with dozens of melted candles scattered across the stone floor and the improvised altar still draped with its stained white cloth. However, the chamber was completely empty of human occupants. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no evidence of the 42 people who had descended these stairs less than 5 hours earlier. The most disturbing discovery came when Dr. Pierce examined the altar cloth more closely and confirmed that the dark stains Patricia had observed were indeed human blood, though laboratory analysis would later prove inconclusive regarding how many individuals had contributed to these stains or when the blood had been deposited on the fabric. Additionally, the rescue team found several personal items scattered throughout the chamber, including Samuel Morrison's distinctive silver pocket watch, Eleanor Blackwood's wedding ring, and a small wooden cross that Patricia Morrison later identified as belonging to her missing brother Timothy. Detective Walsh's investigation extended into the deeper recesses of the crypt system, where his flashlight revealed a network of narrow tunnels extending further into the hillside than the original architectural surveys had indicated. These passages, carved directly from the living rock, showed evidence of recent human passage, including scuff marks on the stone walls and fragments of torn clothing caught on rough stone projections. However, the tunnels eventually became too narrow for adult human passage, terminating in dead ends that offered no explanation for how 42 people could have vanished from the sealed underground chamber. The official investigation continued for 6 weeks under the direction of State Police Captain Thomas Moorhead, who arrived from Raleigh on December 26th with a team of experienced investigators and specialized equipment for underground search operations. Their systematic examination of the crypt system revealed additional disturbing details, including carved symbols on the tunnel walls that appeared to have been recently created, strange acoustic properties that caused voices to echo and distort in unsettling ways, and temperature variations that defied logical explanation given the chamber's depth and insulation from surface weather conditions. Patricia Morrison underwent extensive interviews with multiple law enforcement agencies, medical professionals, and eventually federal investigators when the case was briefly classified as a potential matter of national security due to its occurrence so soon after the Pearl Harbor attack. However, her account remained consistent throughout months of questioning and medical examination, confirmed physical evidence supporting her description of the evening's events, including frostbite patterns consistent with her reported journey through the snowstorm and psychological trauma symptoms that psychiatrist Dr. Helen Cartwright described as entirely genuine and severe. The investigation's most promising lead emerged in late January 1942, when railroad workers discovered abandoned vehicles matching the descriptions of cars owned by several missing congregation members. These automobiles, numbering 17 in total, were found parked in a remote clearing approximately 12 miles southeast of St. Bartholomew's Church, arranged in a precise circular pattern around a central campfire that had burned down to cold ashes. However, this discovery raised more questions than it answered, as investigators could find no evidence of how the missing people had traveled from this location back to the church, nor any indication of where they might have gone after abandoning their vehicles. 43 people entered St. Bartholomew's Crypt on Christmas Eve 1941. Only Patricia Morrison emerged. The others, including Father Bernard Kellerman and her 12-year-old brother Timothy, vanished without trace into the darkness beneath that abandoned church. But according to local residents, sometimes on winter nights when the wind howls through the mountain passes, you can still hear voices singing hymns from somewhere deep underground, and they may be closer than you imagine. This is the story of one of the darkest chapters in criminal history in North Carolina, where faith became a weapon and devotion turned deadly in the winter of 1941. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a like to support our exploration of these forgotten historical mysteries that continue to haunt the American South. The winter of 1941 found America on the precipice of war, but in the rural hills of Caldwell County, North Carolina, a different kind of darkness was brewing. Father Bernard Ashworth had arrived in the small community of Cedar Hollow 3 years prior, bringing with him what locals initially welcomed as renewed spiritual vigor to their struggling parish. The economic hardships of the Depression had left many families desperate for hope, and Father Bernard's passionate sermons seemed to offer exactly what they needed. Cedar Hollow itself was a community of barely 400 souls, nestled in a valley surrounded by ancient Appalachian peaks that had witnessed centuries of human settlement. The local church, St. Matthias Episcopal, had been built in 1887 on the site of an earlier structure destroyed by fire. What made this location particularly unusual was its crypt, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the sanctuary. Historical records from the Caldwell County Historical Society indicate that 37 people had been interred in this underground chamber between 1887 and 1935, though local death records suggest several discrepancies in the numbers. Father Bernard was a tall, gaunt man in his 50s, with penetrating grey eyes and an intensity that both attracted and unsettled his parishioners. Born in Baltimore according to diocesan records, he had served in various rural parishes throughout Virginia and Tennessee before his assignment to Cedar Hollow. What the congregation didn't know was that Father Bernard had been quietly transferred from his previous positions following what church documents euphemistically termed theological irregularities. The trouble began in earnest during the autumn of 1941, when Father Bernard announced his intention to hold a special Christmas Eve service in the church crypt. He proclaimed that this underground vigil would bring the community closer to God by literally descending into the earth, following Christ's example of death and resurrection. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the church organist, later told investigators that she had felt deeply troubled by the proposal, but Father Bernard's charismatic influence over the congregation had grown so strong that few dared to question his decisions. According to surviving church records held in the North Carolina State Archives, 43 parishioners agreed to participate in what Father Bernard called the descent service. These included entire families, the Hendersons, the Mackenzies, the Carters, and the Wolfs, among others. The youngest participant was 7-year-old Sarah Henderson, while the oldest was 81-year-old Thomas Mackenzie, a veteran of the Spanish-American War. The events of December 24, 1941, began normally enough. The regular evening service concluded at 7 o'clock, after which most of the congregation departed for their homes. Only those committed to the special midnight service remained. Witnesses from neighboring properties later reported seeing lantern light flickering in the church windows well past the usual hour, accompanied by what they described as unusual singing that seemed to come from beneath the building itself. Dr. Marcus Holloway, who served as the county medical examiner from 1938 to 1956, documented in his personal journal that he had been approached by several concerned family members during the weeks leading up to Christmas Eve. These individuals expressed worry about their relatives' growing obsession with Father Bernard's teachings, particularly his emphasis on what he termed sacred sacrifice and purification through suffering. Dr. Holloway's journal, discovered in 1967 among his estate papers, contains several entries expressing his own concerns about the priest's mental state. The physical evidence of what occurred in the crypt that night remained largely undisturbed until dawn on Christmas Day, when William Henderson, father of young Sarah, stumbled from the church in a state of complete psychological collapse. Henderson was found by Sheriff James McKnight wandering the village streets, his clothes torn and stained with what appeared to be blood, though he bore no visible injuries. When questioned, Henderson could only repeat the phrase, "They went deeper," over and over again, showing no recognition of his own name or circumstances. Sheriff McKnight's official report, filed with the Caldwell County Clerk's Office on December 26, 1941, provides the first authoritative account of the crime scene discovered in St. Matthias Church. Upon entering the crypt, investigators found clear evidence of a violent struggle. The stone floor was marked with dark stains that testing later confirmed to be human blood. More disturbing were the scratches carved into the limestone walls, which appeared to have been made by human fingernails. These markings extended from floor level to heights of nearly 7 feet, suggesting desperate attempts to climb or escape. The most chilling discovery came when investigators counted the personal effects scattered throughout the crypt. Shoes, coats, jewelry, and other belongings were found belonging to all 43 expected participants, yet only 7 bodies were recovered. Of these 7, the state medical examiner determined that 4 had died from severe trauma consistent with blunt force injuries, while 3 appeared to have died from what the official report termed respiratory failure under extreme stress. Father Bernard's body was among those found, but the condition of his remains raised immediate questions. Unlike the other victims, whose injuries suggested they had been attacked by fellow parishioners in some kind of frenzy, Father Bernard showed signs of having been deliberately restrained. Rope marks on his wrists and ankles indicated he had been bound, and his position near what appeared to be a makeshift altar suggested ritual significance. The altar itself became a focal point of the investigation. Constructed from loose stones found in the crypt, it bore stains and markings that investigators initially attributed to the violence of that night. However, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a forensic specialist called in from the state capitol, noted in her report that the altar showed signs of repeated use over an extended period. Carbon dating performed decades later would confirm that organic material embedded in the stone structure dated back several months, contradicting the assumption that it had been hastily constructed on Christmas Eve. Perhaps most puzzling was the discovery of a collection of journals hidden behind a loose stone in the crypt wall. These notebooks, written in Father Bernard's distinctive handwriting, detailed months of preparation for what he called the Great Offering. The entries, which began in September 1941, revealed a man whose grip on reality had been steadily deteriorating. Early entries focused on theological interpretations of sacrifice and redemption, but later writings became increasingly incoherent, filled with references to voices from below and the ancient covenant. One particularly disturbing entry, dated December 20th, 1941, read, "They have shown me the truth that lies beneath all truth. The congregation believes they come to worship, but they come to fulfill a promise made long before any of us drew breath. The crypt calls and we must answer. Only through complete surrender can we achieve the transformation they demand." Dr. Morrison's psychological evaluation of the surviving evidence concluded that Father Bernard had likely suffered what modern psychiatry would classify as a severe psychotic break. However, her report also noted several elements that defied easy explanation. The precision with which the underground chamber had been prepared, the coordinated nature of what appeared to be multiple participants in the violence, and the complete disappearance of 36 individuals all suggested a level of organization that seemed inconsistent with random psychotic behavior. The investigation took an even stranger turn when Sheriff McKnight began interviewing surviving family members of the missing parishioners. Multiple witnesses reported that their relatives had been behaving unusually in the weeks leading up to Christmas Eve. Margaret Carter, whose husband and 2 sons had vanished, told investigators that her family members had begun speaking in what she described as a different language during their evening prayers. She provided examples of phrases she had overheard, which linguistic experts from Duke University later identified as corrupted Latin mixed with what appeared to be Cherokee words. More disturbing still were reports from children in families where some members had participated in the service. 8-year-old Bobby Mackenzie, whose grandfather Thomas had been among the missing, told investigators that the old man had been talking to the people in the ground for weeks before Christmas Eve. When pressed for details, the boy claimed that his grandfather would stand in their basement and carry on conversations with voices that no one else could hear. Similar reports came from the Henderson household, where William Henderson's wife Martha described her husband's increasingly erratic behavior throughout December. She reported that he had begun walking in his sleep, often found standing in their cellar speaking to empty air. Most significantly, she stated that on 3 occasions she had followed him outside at night, where he would walk directly to the church and stand motionless in the cemetery for hours before returning home with no memory of his actions. Dr. Morrison's final report, submitted to state authorities in March 1942, concluded that the Christmas Eve incident represented a case of mass psychosis triggered by Father Bernard's deteriorating mental state and exacerbated by the extreme stress of wartime uncertainty. She theorized that the missing 36 individuals had fled the scene during the violence and, traumatized by what they had witnessed, had chosen to abandon their previous lives rather than face questioning about their involvement. This explanation satisfied most officials, particularly given the wartime disruption that made thorough investigation difficult. However, several aspects of the case continued to trouble those closely involved. The complete absence of any trace of the missing individuals proved particularly puzzling. Despite extensive searches of the surrounding wilderness and inquiries with law enforcement agencies throughout the region, not a single confirmed sighting was ever reported. More troubling was the fate of the other survivors. Besides William Henderson, 2 other participants had initially survived the events in the crypt. Mary Susan Carter and elderly James Wolfe were found in catatonic states similar to Henderson's condition. All 3 were committed to the state psychiatric facility in Raleigh, where they remained for the rest of their lives. Medical records from the hospital, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1980s, revealed that none of the 3 ever recovered the ability to speak coherently about the events of December 24, 1941. However, the hospital records do contain several disturbing notations about the behavior of these patients. Nursing staff reported that all 3 would become agitated at the same times each month, always during the new moon. During these episodes, they would attempt to dig through the floors of their rooms, clawing at the linoleum and concrete until their fingernails bled. When restrained, they would repeat the same phrases William Henderson had spoken to Sheriff McKnight. They went deeper, and the covenant calls. The mystery deepened in 1943 when the Army Corps of Engineers conducted a survey of the Cedar Hollow area as part of a proposed military training facility. Their geological survey of the region revealed an extensive cave system beneath the church and surrounding cemetery. More significantly, they discovered that the church crypt connected to these natural caverns through a passage that had been artificially widened sometime in the recent past. Tool marks on the limestone walls suggested that this excavation had been completed using hand tools over a period of several months. This discovery raised immediate questions about Father Bernard's activities prior to the Christmas Eve service. If he had been aware of the cave system and had spent months preparing access to it, the entire incident took on a more premeditated character. Unfortunately, the Corps of Engineers' complete report was classified due to wartime security concerns and remained unavailable to civilian investigators for several decades. The case officially remained open but inactive until 1964, when Professor Jonathan Reeves of Appalachian State University began conducting research into historical religious practices in rural North Carolina. Dr. Reeves, a specialist in American folklore and religious studies, initially approached the Cedar Hollow incident as an example of religious extremism, exacerbated by social and economic pressures. However, his investigation soon uncovered evidence that suggested far more complex underlying factors. Working with graduate student assistant Maria Santos, Dr. Reeves spent the summer of 1964 conducting extensive interviews with elderly residents of Caldwell County who remembered the events of 1941. These conversations revealed a pattern of unusual incidents in the Cedar Hollow area dating back to the late 19th century. Multiple sources described strange disappearances, unexplained sounds from underground, and periodic reports of figures seen moving through the forest at night who seemed to vanish when approached. Most significantly, Dr. Reeves discovered that the 1941 incident was not the first time St. Matthias Church had been the site of mysterious disappearances. Church records from 1893, found in the basement of the county courthouse, documented the sudden departure of the entire previous congregation following what was described only as theological differences with church leadership. The parallels to the 1941 case were impossible to ignore, particularly given that both incidents occurred during winter months and involved the church's underground crypt. Dr. Reeves's investigation took a dramatic turn when he gained access to the previously classified Army Corps of Engineers report from 1943. The complete geological survey revealed that the cave system beneath Cedar Hollow was far more extensive than previously known, stretching for miles through the surrounding mountains. More troubling were notations in the report describing evidence of long-term human habitation in several of the deeper caverns, including primitive shelters and what appeared to be ceremonial chambers. The Corps of Engineers team had also discovered human remains in multiple locations throughout the cave system. While most appeared to be ancient, predating European settlement of the region, several showed evidence of more recent deposition. The report noted that these newer remains were found in circumstances suggesting they had been deliberately placed in specific locations within the caves, though the military survey team had not conducted detailed forensic analysis. Armed with this new information, Dr. Reeves obtained permission to conduct his own exploration of the cave system during the summer of 1965. Accompanied by 2 experienced cavers and a photographer, he descended through the passage connecting the church crypt to the natural caverns below. What they discovered there would haunt Dr. Reeves for the remainder of his life. The team's photographs and detailed notes, preserved in the Appalachian State University archives, document a complex underground environment that showed clear signs of organized human activity. Multiple chambers had been modified with stone walls and primitive architectural features. Most disturbing were the ceremonial spaces, which contained carved symbols that Dr. Reeves identified as a mixture of Christian iconography and much older religious markings consistent with pre-Columbian Native American traditions. In the deepest accessible portion of the cave system, nearly a quarter mile beneath the church, Dr. Reeves's team made their most significant discovery. A large natural chamber, which they designated as the cathedral, contained what could only be described as an underground settlement. Stone structures suggested permanent habitation, while carefully arranged human remains indicated centuries of ritual activity. Carbon dating of organic materials found in this chamber later confirmed human presence dating back over 800 years. Most chilling was Dr. Reeves's discovery of more recent evidence in the cathedral chamber. Personal effects that matched items belonging to several of the 1941 missing persons were found arranged around what appeared to be a central altar. These included a pocket watch belonging to Thomas Mackenzie, a wedding ring matching the description of one worn by Ruth Carter, and a child's shoe that corresponded to those worn by young Sarah Henderson. However, these discoveries raised more questions than they answered. The items showed no signs of decay or weathering that would be expected after 24 years in the damp cave environment. More puzzling still, They were arranged in deliberate patterns around the altar, suggesting they had been placed recently rather than left behind during some panicked flight in 1941. Dr. Reeves's final expedition to the caves took place in October 1965, when he returned alone to conduct additional photographic documentation. His colleagues at the university later reported that he had become increasingly obsessed with what he called the deeper truth about the Cedar Hollow incident. Dr. Reeves was found 3 days after entering the caves, sitting motionless in the cathedral chamber, in a state of complete catatonia, remarkably similar to that exhibited by the 1941 survivors. Hospital records from Dr. Reeves's treatment show that he remained conscious but unresponsive for 6 weeks before slowly beginning to recover his ability to communicate. However, like the earlier survivors, he retained no coherent memory of his final cave expedition. The only clue to his experience came in the form of a single phrase he repeated during his early recovery. "They are still there, waiting deeper than anyone dares to go." The investigation into the Cedar Hollow mystery continues to attract researchers, though few have been willing to explore the physical site as thoroughly as Dr. Reeves. The cave system remains accessible through the church crypt, though local authorities have installed gates to prevent unauthorized entry, following several incidents in the 1970s and 1980s involving amateur explorers who emerged in various states of psychological distress. Current park rangers and county officials report ongoing unusual activity in the Cedar Hollow area, including unexplained sounds from underground, electronic equipment malfunctions, and periodic discoveries of personal items belonging to people who disappeared decades ago. The mystery of what happened on Christmas Eve 1941 remains unsolved, but the evidence suggests that whatever force drew Father Bernard and his congregation into those depths continues to exert its influence on anyone who ventures too close to the truth. 43 people descended into the crypt of St. Matthias Church on December 24, 1941. Only 4 ever returned to the surface with their sanity intact. The others may still be down there, in chambers deeper than anyone has dared to explore, waiting for the next group of believers willing to answer their call. This is the story of one of the darkest chapters in criminal history in rural Carolina, a tale that challenges everything we thought we knew about faith, community, and the shadows that lurk beneath small-town respectability. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a like if you find this investigation compelling. The winter of 1941 brought an unusual harshness to Millbrook County, Carolina. Snow fell earlier and deeper than anyone could remember, isolating the already remote farming communities scattered throughout the pine forests. It was during this bitter December that Father Bernard Whitmore made a decision that would forever stain the history of St. Bartholomew's Parish. According to documents preserved in the Millbrook County Historical Society archives, Father Whitmore had been serving the small congregation for nearly 15 years, earning a reputation as a devoted, if somewhat eccentric minister who often spoke of older truths that predated modern Christianity. The church itself stood at the crossroads of 3 dirt paths, a modest wooden structure built in 1887, but it was what lay beneath the church that would prove significant. During construction, workers had discovered a stone chamber of unknown origin, which the original pastor had consecrated as a crypt. Local newspaper records from the Millbrook Gazette, dated December 1887, described the chamber as a curious remnant of earlier inhabitants, featuring carved symbols of uncertain meaning. On December 23, 1941, 37 parishioners gathered for what Father Whitmore announced would be a special Christmas vigil, to be held in the crypt beneath the church. By Christmas morning, 28 of them would be found dead, under circumstances that official records describe as mass poisoning, though witnesses who survived would tell a very different story. Something far more disturbing occurred in that underground chamber, something that continues to manifest itself in the forests of Carolina to this day. The parishioners who answered Father Whitmore's call represented the core families of the rural community. Among them were Samuel and Martha Hendricks, who had farmed the same land for 3 generations, young Thomas Crawley, barely 16 and eager to prove his devotion, and elderly Mrs. Abigail Monroe, whose family had helped build the original church. According to surviving correspondence discovered in the basement of the old parsonage in 1967, Father Whitmore had been planning this special service for months, writing to various antiquarian societies and requesting translations of symbols found carved into the crypt walls. Dr. Helena Marsh, professor of religious studies at Duke University, spent considerable time examining these letters during her research in the 1970s. Her findings, published in the Journal of Appalachian Studies in 1974, revealed that Father Whitmore had become increasingly obsessed with what he termed the original covenant that bound the land. His correspondence mentions signs and portents appearing throughout 1941, including livestock found arranged in unusual patterns and parishioners reporting shared dreams of underground ceremonies. The evening of December 23rd began typically enough. Parishioners arrived at the church as dusk settled over the snow-covered landscape. Mrs. Dorothy Fairchild, one of the 9 survivors, would later tell investigators that Father Whitmore seemed transformed that evening, speaking in a voice that carried unusual authority. According to her statement, preserved in the Millbrook County Sheriff's Office files, the priest led them down wooden steps into the crypt, where he had arranged candles in patterns that corresponded to the carved symbols on the walls. The crypt itself measured approximately 20 feet by 30 feet, with a vaulted stone ceiling that dated to at least the early 1800s, possibly earlier. Archaeological surveys conducted by the University of North Carolina in 1978 revealed that the chamber showed signs of regular use long before the church was built above it. Carbon dating of organic residues found in carved grooves suggested centuries of ritualistic activity, though the nature of these earlier ceremonies remained unclear. What happened next defies conventional explanation. According to testimony given by survivor James Crawford to Sheriff Martin Pike on December 26, 1941, Father Whitmore began reading from a text that none of the parishioners recognized, despite their familiarity with Scripture. The language was described as neither Latin nor English, but somehow familiar. As he read, the carved symbols on the walls began to emit a faint phosphorescent glow, starting with the symbol directly behind the makeshift altar. Mrs. Fairchild's account, corroborated by 3 other survivors, describes a progressive change in the atmosphere of the chamber. The temperature began to drop noticeably, despite the presence of 37 people and dozens of candles. More disturbing was the sound that began to emanate from the walls themselves, a low humming that seemed to resonate in their bones. Young Thomas Crawley, seated near the front, was the first to show signs of distress, clutching his chest and speaking in the same unknown language as Father Whitmore. The official investigation, led by Sheriff Pike and Dr. Samuel Morrison, the county coroner, concluded that the deaths resulted from carbon monoxide poisoning caused by inadequate ventilation in the sealed chamber. This explanation satisfied state authorities and allowed for the quick burial of the deceased. However, documents discovered decades later reveal significant inconsistencies in this official account. Dr. Morrison's private notes, found in his estate papers in 1963, described physical evidence that contradicted his public findings. The bodies of the deceased showed no signs of the cherry-red coloration typical of carbon monoxide poisoning. Instead, according to Morrison's suppressed notes, they displayed a peculiar pallor and what he described as crystalline formations around the eyes and mouth. More disturbing were the positions in which they were found. Rather than the random collapse expected from gas poisoning, the bodies were arranged in concentric circles around a central point where Father Whitmore lay, his arms spread wide and his face locked in what Morrison privately described as an expression of terrible ecstasy. The 9 survivors were found near the crypt entrance in various states of consciousness. All suffered from selective amnesia regarding the final hours of the service. Dr. Morrison's examination revealed no physical injuries, but psychological evaluations conducted weeks later showed signs of severe trauma. Most telling was their shared insistence that the service had lasted many hours, despite the fact that they were found less than 2 hours after the gathering began. Local journalist Robert Hayes, writing for the Millbrook Gazette, initially accepted the official explanation, but later became convinced that crucial facts had been suppressed. His investigation, conducted over several months in 1942, uncovered witness testimony that had been excluded from official reports. Neighbors living within a mile of the church reported seeing unusual lights emanating from the building during the early morning hours of December 24th, well after the bodies had supposedly been discovered. More compelling was Hayes's interview with Deputy Sheriff William Morse, who had been first on the scene. Speaking off the record, Morse described finding the church doors standing wide open, despite the bitter cold, with snow having blown into the nave, but leaving the stairway to the crypt completely clear. He also reported that all the candles in the crypt were still burning when they arrived, despite the lack of oxygen that should have accompanied fatal carbon monoxide levels. The case might have remained a local tragedy with an unsatisfactory official explanation, if not for the dedicated research of Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a professor of anthropology at Appalachian State University. In 1968, Dr. Sinclair began investigating reports of similar incidents throughout the Carolina region, part of a broader study of folk religious practices in isolated communities. Her research, initially focused on documenting dying traditions, uncovered a pattern of unexplained deaths and disappearances centered around locations with pre-colonial stone structures. Dr. Sinclair's methodology was meticulous. She spent months in local archives combing through newspaper morgues, church records, and county documents. Her breakthrough came when she discovered that the 1941 incident was not isolated. Records dating back to the 1890s revealed a cycle of unusual deaths occurring roughly every 15 to 20 years, always during winter months and always connected to the crypt beneath St. Bartholomew's Church. The earliest documented incident occurred in 1893, when a group of 12 men gathering for a winter solstice prayer meeting were found frozen to death in the crypt, despite evidence of a substantial fire having burned throughout the night. In 1911, a traveling evangelist named Jeremiah Cross led 18 followers into the chamber for what he called a revelation service. Only 5 emerged, and those survivors spent the remainder of their lives in the state asylum, speaking obsessively about the awakening and drawing the same symbols that were carved into the crypt walls. Dr. Sinclair's investigation took a dramatic turn in 1972 when she gained access to the private papers of Father Whitmore's predecessor, Father Michael O'Malley, who had served St. Bartholomew's from 1895 to 1926. Hidden in the false bottom of an old trunk, she discovered a journal that documented O'Malley's growing concern about the influence of the crypt. His entries, written in a mixture of English and Latin, describe his attempts to seal the chamber permanently and his failure to convince church authorities of the danger it represented. Father O'Malley's journal reveals that he had researched the history of the land extensively, corresponding with historians and tribal elders from the Cherokee Nation. According to his notes, the site of St. Bartholomew's Church had been considered sacred by indigenous peoples for centuries before European settlement, but it was a dark sacredness associated with death and transformation. The stone chamber predated any known settlement, possibly by hundreds of years, and had been used for rituals that were considered dangerous, even by shamanic standards. Most disturbing were O'Malley's accounts of his own experiences in the crypt. During routine inspections of the chamber, he reported hearing voices speaking in unknown languages, finding candles lit that had not been there previously, and discovering carved symbols that appeared overnight, despite the chamber being locked and sealed. His final entries, dated shortly before his transfer to another parish in 1926, describe his conviction that something was stirring beneath the church, something that grew stronger during the darkest months of the year. Dr. Sinclair's research suffered a tragic setback in November 1973. While conducting overnight observations in the church itself, hoping to document any unusual phenomena, she disappeared without explanation. Her rental car was found parked outside the church the following morning, with her research materials scattered across the front seat. A search of the building revealed her recording equipment set up in the nave, with tapes that captured only silence until the final recording, which documented what investigators described as unexplained acoustic phenomena. The investigation into Dr. Sinclair's disappearance was led by State Police Detective Raymond Walsh, whose report remains classified to this day. However, Copies obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests in 1987 reveal several troubling details. Dr. Sinclair's final notes, found in her hotel room, indicated she had decoded some of the symbols carved in the crypt walls. According to her translations, the markings described a process called the deep calling, a ritual that opened pathways between the world of the living and something she termed the hungering dark. Contemporary investigations have connected the St. Bartholomew's incidents to a broader pattern of disappearances throughout the Appalachian region. Forest Service reports from the 1980s document numerous cases of hikers and campers vanishing in areas that contain similar pre-colonial stone structures. Park Ranger Jennifer Martinez, working in the Pisgah National Forest, has filed official reports describing encounters with individuals who match descriptions of people who disappeared decades earlier, though they show no signs of aging and speak in archaic dialects. In 1994, a team of paranormal investigators equipped with modern recording equipment attempted to spend a night in the St. Bartholomew's Crypt. Their footage, later analyzed by audio specialists at North Carolina State University, captured voices speaking in the same unknown language described by witnesses in 1941. More unsettling were the thermal imaging recordings that showed temperature fluctuations forming patterns identical to the carved symbols on the walls. The most recent incident occurred in 2003, when 3 graduate students from UNC conducting archaeological research in the area reported being approached by a man matching Father Whitmore's description. According to their statement to local authorities, the figure invited them to participate in a Christmas service that would reveal ancient truths. The students fled the area, but security cameras at a nearby gas station captured footage of a figure in clerical robes standing motionless in the forest, visible for several hours despite sub-freezing temperatures. Digital analysis of this footage by Dr. Alan Peters, professor of digital forensics at Wake Forest University, revealed anomalies that suggest the image was not entirely physical. The figure cast no shadow despite bright lighting and appeared to exhibit properties of electromagnetic disturbance. Most disturbing was Dr. Peters' discovery that the figure's mouth movements corresponded to audio frequencies detected by seismic equipment in the area, suggesting the entity was speaking continuously despite being miles from any recording equipment. Local historians have documented a significant increase in unusual phenomena surrounding St. Bartholomew's Church since 2000. The building itself, abandoned since 1975, shows signs of regular use despite being sealed by county authorities. Candles appear lit in the windows during winter months, and residents report the sound of hymns being sung in languages they cannot identify. Multiple attempts to demolish the structure have failed due to equipment malfunctions and accidents that investigators cannot explain. The crypt beneath the church remains the focus of ongoing concern. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2010 revealed that the chamber extends far deeper underground than previously known, connecting to a network of natural caves that stretch for miles beneath the Carolina mountains. Geological surveys suggest these caves show signs of artificial modification dating back centuries, with carved passages that lead to chambers containing symbols identical to those found in the church crypt. Perhaps most troubling are the reports from descendants of the 1941 survivors. Several families have documented a hereditary condition they describe as the calling, a compulsion that affects family members during winter months, drawing them toward the abandoned church. Medical examinations have found no physical cause for this condition, but psychological evaluations reveal shared symptoms, including vivid dreams of underground ceremonies and the ability to understand the unknown language captured in recordings from the crypt. The official position of both state and federal authorities is that the St. Bartholomew's Church incidents represent a series of tragic accidents compounded by local folklore and suggestion. However, internal documents obtained through legal channels reveal that the site remains under discreet surveillance, with motion detectors and thermal sensors monitoring the area year-round. Reports filed by security personnel describe regular activation of these systems, though investigation invariably finds no physical presence. The truth about what occurred in that Carolina crypt on Christmas Eve 1941 remains elusive buried beneath layers of official denial and deliberate obfuscation. Yet the pattern of incidents, the consistent witness testimony across decades, and the ongoing phenomena suggest that something far more complex than mass poisoning claimed the lives of those 28 parishioners. The evidence points to an awakening of forces that predate human settlement of the region, entities that view our world as territory to be reclaimed, through rituals that transform the living into something else entirely. Those who study these incidents recommend extreme caution when traveling through remote areas of the Carolina Mountains, particularly during winter months. If you encounter abandoned churches or unexplained stone structures, do not investigate alone. If you hear voices singing in unfamiliar languages, leave the area immediately. And if someone in clerical robes approaches you with an invitation to witness ancient truths, remember that 37 people entered that crypt in December 1941. Only 9 emerged unchanged, and even they carried something dark within them for the rest of their lives. The others became something that still walks the Carolina forests, calling to the living with voices that promise revelation, but deliver only an eternal, hungry darkness that grows stronger with each passing winter.